The stillness of Clay, New York, was shattered on a late September afternoon in 2005 by a voice that seemed to vibrate with a jagged, high-frequency panic. Stacey Castor told the 911 dispatcher that her husband, David, had locked himself in their bedroom and refused to come out. He was depressed, she said, weary from a weekend spent in the trenches of a marital dispute. When deputies finally breached the door, they found David naked and unmoving, his body surrounded by the heavy artificial scent of ethylene glycol. A half-drunk glass of antifreeze sat on the nightstand, along with a turkey baster, its tip stained with the same neon green liquid. It appeared to be a textbook suicide, a man driven to the edge by his own demons. But as the investigators watched Stacey standing in the hallway, they couldn't ignore the chilling coincidence. This was the second husband she had stood over in less than 5 years. They didn't know it yet, but the woman in front of them wasn't a victim of misfortune. She was a predator who used the domestic comforts of home as her primary weapon. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. The story of Stacey Castor doesn't begin with a vial of poison or a life insurance policy, but in the quiet, salt-of-the-earth neighborhoods of central New York, where the winters are long and the families are tightly knit. Born Stacey Ruth Daniels in 1967, she was, by all outward appearances, a product of her environment, a woman who valued the stability of a suburban life and the traditional milestones of marriage and motherhood. Those who knew her in her youth saw a girl who was capable and driven, though perhaps with a coolness beneath the surface that few bothered to investigate. In the late 1980s, Stacey met Michael Wallace, a man who seemed to be her perfect topographical match. Michael was kind, hardworking, and possessed a gentle disposition that balanced Stacey's more assertive, controlling nature. They were young and full of the localized ambition common to the Syracuse area. By 1988, they had wed, embarking on a decade of what neighbors described as the American dream in miniature. Michael worked as a dispatcher for a local company, while Stacey took on administrative roles, eventually finding her footing in office management. Together, they bought a modest home in Clay, New York, a town where the sound of lawnmowers and school buses provided the soundtrack to a supposedly idyllic existence. The arrival of their first daughter, Ashley, in 1987, followed by their second, Bree, in 1991, seemed to solidify the Castor-Wallace foundation. To the outside observer, Stacey was the quintessential supermom. She was the one who organized the bake sales, the one who ensured the girls were dressed in coordinating outfits for church, and the one who managed the family's finances with an iron fist. Michael, meanwhile, was the doting father, the man who would spend his weekends playing in the yard with his daughters, his laughter echoing against the siding of their suburban sanctuary. But beneath this veneer of domestic bliss, the gears of a much darker mechanism were beginning to turn. Friends later recalled that Stacey's management of the household often veered into the territory of total domination. She was not merely the bookkeeper, she was the gatekeeper. Michael, despite being the primary earner for much of their early marriage, often found himself asking permission for even the smallest expenditures. There was a subtle, growing tension, a friction between Michael's desire for a relaxed, happy home and Stacey's pathological need for order and, more importantly, for more. Stacey was a woman who looked at the neighbors' larger cars and newer renovations, not with inspiration, but with a cold, calculating envy. As the 1990s drew to a close, the perfect marriage began to show microscopic fractures. Michael started complaining of mysterious ailments, fatigue, stomach cramps, and a persistent low-grade malaise that the doctors in Syracuse couldn't quite pin down. He was a man in his early 30s, supposedly in the prime of his life, yet he was becoming a ghost in his own home. He would come home from work and collapse into his recliner, too exhausted to engage with Ashley and Bree. Stacey, rather than showing the frantic worry of a concerned spouse, maintained a stoic, almost clinical detachment. She was the one bringing him his drinks, his medicines, and his evening meals, tucked away in the privacy of their kitchen where no one else was watching. In the final months of 1999, the atmosphere in the Wallace home had shifted from domestic to stagnant. Michael felt like he was walking through waist-deep water every single day. He told his doctors he felt heavy, as if his very blood had turned to lead. Yet every test came back inconclusive. There was no cancer, no obvious infection, no reason for a healthy man to be fading away. Stacey remained at his side, the devoted wife, the woman who handled every pharmacy run and every doctor's appointment. She was crafting a narrative of Michael as a sickly man, a story she whispered to friends and family so that when the end finally came, no one would be truly surprised. She was setting the stage for her first major performance, ensuring that when the curtain fell on Michael Wallace, she would be the only one left standing in the spotlight, holding the keys to everything they had built together. The girls, Ashley and Bree, watched their father wither, unaware that the person nursing him was the very one presiding over his decline. It was a masterclass in psychological camouflage. In a town like Clay, where everyone knows their neighbor's business, Stacey managed to keep the true nature of her household a total secret, buried under layers of suburban normalcy and the mundane routine of school runs and grocery trips. She wasn't just Michael's wife, she was becoming his executor, long before his heart took its final beat. The year 2000 was supposed to be a milestone of new beginnings, a fresh millennium for a family that had spent the previous decade building a fortress of suburban respectability. Instead, it became the year the walls of the Wallace household began to exude a quiet, medicinal rot. Michael Wallace, a man who should have been in the robust prime of his 38 years, was becoming a stranger to his own strength. The vibrant father who once chased Ashley and Bree through the sprinklers of their Clay, New York backyard was now a skeletal figure, tethered to his recliner by a fatigue that felt more like a heavy, suffocating shroud than simple exhaustion. Stacey Castor, ever the stoic administrator, watched this decline with a detachment that many neighbors mistook for strength. She was the one who managed the growing pile of medical bills, the one who navigated the confusing labyrinth of insurance claims, and most crucially, the one who controlled every drop of liquid that passed Michael's lips. She was nursing him, a term she used frequently when explaining to friends why Michael couldn't make it to a weekend barbecue or why his voice sounded so thin and reedy on the phone. She was carefully curating a narrative of a man whose heart was failing him, ensuring that those around them were primed to accept the inevitable. In late 1999, Michael's health had taken a sharp, unexplained turn for the worse. He complained of a persistent metallic taste in his mouth, a detail that Stacey dismissed as a side effect of his stress or a minor stomach bug. But the bug never left. It burrowed in, manifesting as agonizing abdominal cramps and a brain fog that made it impossible for him to focus on his work as a dispatcher. By the time the winter of 2000 arrived, Michael was frequently absent from his job, his income drying up just as Stacey's taste for the finer things in life was expanding. The tension in the house was no longer just about Michael's health. It was about the control Stacey exerted over their dwindling resources. Then came January 2000. It was the month of Michael's 38th birthday, but there were no grand celebrations. The air in the house was thick with the scent of antiseptic and a strange, cloying sweetness that Stacey seemed to favor in her cleaning products. On a morning that seemed like any other Tuesday, Michael's struggle reached its terminal velocity. He was found unresponsive. His heart, the same heart that had supposedly been under the care of doctors, simply stopped. The scene was a masterclass in domestic tragedy. Stacey was the grieving widow, her face a mask of practiced sorrow as the paramedics worked in vain. She told the authorities exactly what they expected to hear. Michael had been sick for a long time. He was depressed, he was overworked, and his body had simply given out. She emphasized his pre-existing conditions, effectively leading the medical examiner down a garden path of natural causes. Because there were no obvious signs of trauma, no struggle, no blood, no shattered windows, the system did what it often does in the face of a natural death in the suburbs. It looked the other way. No autopsy was performed. It was an oversight that would haunt the Syracuse legal system for a decade. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack, a tidy conclusion for a messy, lingering illness. Stacey, however, was already moving. Within days of the funeral, the devoted wife had transformed into the efficient executor. Michael had life insurance, A policy that Stacey had ensured was kept current even as they struggled with other bills. The payout wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to clear the slate and to provide Stacey with the seed money for her next transformation. To Ashley and Bree, the loss of their father was a seismic event that fractured their childhoods. They looked to their mother for stability, unaware that the woman they clung to was the architect of their grief. Stacey used their sorrow as a tool, a way to further insulate herself from suspicion. How could a woman who comforted her sobbing daughters be capable of something so monstrous? It was a psychological shield that proved impenetrable. In the months following Michael's death, Stacey didn't just mourn, she rebranded. She began to distance herself from the sickly life she had shared with Michael, looking toward the horizon for someone who could offer more than a dispatcher's salary and a modest home. She was a widow, yes, but she was a young one, and she was hungry for a life that Michael Wallace could never have provided. The neighbors watched as the black veils were tucked away, replaced by a renewed focus on her appearance and her social standing. The tragedy of Michael Wallace became a footnote in Stacey's story, a sad preamble to the real life she was about to build. She spoke of him in the past tense with a cold finality, as if he were a piece of furniture that had simply worn out and needed replacing. There were no whispers of foul play in Clay at that time. Why would there be? In the quiet, tree-lined streets of central New York, monsters aren't supposed to look like soccer moms. They aren't supposed to be the ones who bring the casserole to the wake. But as Stacey Castor stood in her kitchen, perhaps washing out a glass that Michael had used only hours before his death, she knew that she had successfully navigated the most dangerous part of her plan. She had learned that the system was lazy, that grief was a perfect camouflage, and that in the world of Stacey Castor, people were merely obstacles to be managed or removed. The stage was now clear. The first husband was in the ground, the insurance money was in the bank, and the daughters were under her total control. Stacey was ready for her next act, and this time, the stakes and the cruelty would only increase. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a predator who had just finished her first successful hunt, and she was already looking for the next trail to follow. With Michael Wallace barely cold in the ground and the insurance money cleared, Stacey didn't wait for the grass to grow over the family plot. In the tight-knit circles of Syracuse and its surrounding suburbs, a young, capable widow like Stacey didn't stay unattached for long, especially not when she was actively hunting for an upgrade. In 2001, just a year after her first husband's heart mysteriously gave out, Stacey met David Castor. If Michael had been the steady, low-key dispatcher, David was his polar opposite, a self-made, high-energy entrepreneur who owned a successful heating and air conditioning business. He was a man of means, a man with a huge heart who was known to pay for strangers' groceries or lend money interest-free to friends in a bind. To Stacey, David Castor wasn't just a romantic interest, he was a promotion. The courtship was swift, a whirlwind of domestic integration that saw Stacey moving herself and her two daughters, Ashley and Bree, into David's life with surgical precision. David, who had been through a divorce and had a son of his own, was drawn to the idea of a ready-made family. He saw Stacey as a hard-working, devoted mother who had survived a tragic loss with her dignity intact. They married in 2003, and the new Castor family moved into a sprawling, beautiful home in a prestigious neighborhood in Clay. For Stacey, this was the arrival. The modest Wallace house was a memory. She now presided over a household funded by a thriving business, complete with high-end cars and the social standing she had always craved. However, the ideal couple veneer that the neighbors saw was masking a volatile power struggle that began almost as soon as the rings were exchanged. David Castor was a man who worked hard and expected to enjoy the fruits of his labor, but he quickly found that his new wife had a very specific idea of how those fruits should be distributed. Stacey didn't just want to be a partner in the marriage, she wanted to be the CFO of David's life. She took over the books for his business, Jewelry Gallery, and began to exert the same chillingly tight control over his finances that had characterized her first marriage. The tension wasn't just financial. David's son, David Jr., became a focal point of Stacey's resentment. She viewed the boy and the financial support David provided to his ex-wife for his upbringing as a drain on the Castor resources that should belong solely to her and her daughters. The household became a theater of subtle psychological warfare. Stacey worked tirelessly to alienate David from his son, whispering about perceived slights and manufactured disrespect. She wanted David's world to shrink until she was the only thing at its center. As the months rolled into 2005, the atmosphere in the large house on the hill grew suffocating. David, once energetic and talkative, began to show signs of a familiar, brooding weariness. The man who loved racing cars and karting, a passion he shared with his son, found himself increasingly isolated from the hobbies that gave him joy. Stacey was always there, a constant managing presence, caring for him in a way that felt more like house arrest than affection. She had replaced his longtime office staff with herself, ensuring that even at work, David was under her gaze. Friends noticed that David seemed different. The completely fearless man was becoming hesitant, his spark dimmed. There were arguments, loud, jagged disputes about money, about the kids, and about Stacey's overbearing nature. David was beginning to realize that the woman he had married wasn't the grieving widow he had pitied, but a woman with a bottomless hunger for control. He started talking about a life without her, about a divorce that would reclaim his business and his peace of mind. To Stacey, this was an existential threat. A divorce meant a return to the middle-class struggle. It meant losing the jewelry gallery and the prestige of the Castor name. In the late summer of 2005, history began to repeat itself with terrifying symmetry. David started feeling off. He complained of stomach issues and a strange, lingering lethargy that didn't match the heat of the New York summer. Just like Michael Wallace before him, a healthy, middle-aged man was suddenly falling apart at the seams. And just like before, Stacey was right there with the medicine, the special drinks, and the closed bedroom door. She told the daughters that David was just stressed, that he needed to be left alone to recover from his bad moods. The neighbors saw the beautiful house and the expensive cars in the driveway, and they assumed the Castors were living the dream. They didn't see the man inside, naked and sick, trapped in a bedroom while his wife patrolled the hallway. They didn't know that Stacey was already looking at the jewelry gallery, not as a business to be managed, but as an inheritance to be claimed. The Black Widow was spinning a new web, and David Castor, with his huge heart and his successful life, was the fly that had finally stopped struggling. Stacey had learned from Michael's death that the system didn't ask questions if the story was consistent. She was ready to tell a new story, one of a depressed husband who couldn't handle the pressure of his own success. All she needed was the right moment and the right delivery system for the bitter end she had planned for him. The children, Ashley and Bree, were now teenagers, more observant and more integrated into the household's darkness. They lived in the shadow of their mother's growing intensity, witnesses to a perfect family that was rotting from the inside out. Stacey was no longer just a mother or a wife. She was a sovereign, and anyone who threatened her reign, including the man who had given her everything, was about to find out exactly how far she would go to keep it. The stage was set for the incident, a weekend of horror that would finally bring the cold, suburban monster into the light of a police interrogation room. The atmosphere inside the Castor residence in Clay, New York, during the final weekend of August 2005, was not merely tense. It was thick with the suffocating anticipation of a terminal event. For years, Stacey had maintained the facade of the devoted middle-class wife, but by Sunday, August 22nd, the masks were slipping. David Castor, a man once defined by his fearless pursuit of speed and his booming jewelry and HVAC businesses, had become a ghost in his own home. He was no longer the vibrant consultant who could win over any client in minutes. He was a man trapped in a sprawling, silent house, physically deteriorating under the care of a woman who viewed his existence as a financial hurdle. The crisis began to peak late that Sunday evening. According to Stacey's later, carefully constructed narrative, the couple had engaged in a marital dispute, a phrase she used to sanitize what was likely a desperate attempt by David to reclaim his autonomy. Stacey claimed that David, overwhelmed by depression and the weight of their argument, had retreated to their primary bedroom and locked the door from the inside. She told her daughters, Ashley and Bree, that their stepfather was throwing a tantrum and needed to be left alone. It was a classic Stacey maneuver, isolating the victim while framing his distress as a character flaw to any potential witnesses. Throughout Monday, August 23rd, the house remained eerily quiet. Stacey went about her business with a chilling, clinical normalcy. She didn't call for help. She didn't bang on the door. She didn't express the frantic worry of a wife whose husband had been silent for 24 hours. Instead, she waited. It wasn't until Tuesday afternoon, nearly 48 hours after David had allegedly locked himself away, that Stacey finally dialed 911. Her voice on the recording was a jagged, high-frequency performance of panic, a stark contrast to the calculated silence she had maintained since Sunday. When deputies from the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department arrived at the prestigious neighborhood, they found a scene that looked like a textbook suicide, if one didn't look too closely. After kicking in the locked bedroom door, they were hit by the chemical, cloying scent of ethylene glycol, antifreeze. David Castor lay naked on the bed, unmoving and cold. He was surrounded by the remnants of a desperate end: 2 glasses on the nightstand, one containing a bright green liquid, and a turkey baster. The tip of the baster was coated in the same neon green poison. To the first responders, it appeared David had used the kitchen tool to force the lethal fluid down his own throat when his resolve wavered. Stacey stood in the hallway, her face a mask of practiced sorrow. She immediately began feeding the investigators the why. She spoke of David's hidden depression, his stress over the business, and a recent meltdown over his father's death. She was providing the motive for his self-destruction before the body was even warm. But as the detectives processed the room, small, jagged details began to snag on their intuition. There was no suicide note. There were no signs of a man who had struggled with the searing, internal agony that antifreeze causes as it crystallizes the kidneys and dissolves the organs. David looked as though he had simply drifted off, a physical impossibility for someone dying of ethylene glycol poisoning unless they were already incapacitated. The turkey baster was the most glaring anomaly. Why would a man committing suicide use a culinary tool to ingest poison? It suggested a level of external force, a delivery system that required a second pair of hands. Furthermore, the bedroom door, which Stacey claimed was locked from the inside, had been breached with suspicious ease, and the suicide glass on the nightstand bore only Stacey's fingerprints. David's prints were nowhere to be found on the vessel that supposedly killed him. As David's body was wheeled out of the house, Stacey didn't crumble. She began the efficient executor phase of her performance almost immediately. She checked the status of David's life insurance policies, totaling over $1 million, and began inquiries into the jewelry gallery accounts. She was a widow for the second time in 5 years, yet her primary concern seemed to be the logistics of her new inheritance. To her daughters, Ashley and Bree, she maintained the lie. Their stepfather had chosen to leave them, and it was now the 3 of them against the world. The detectives, however, were not as easily swayed as the neighbors in Clay. They began to dig into Stacey's history, and what they found was a trail of bodies and unfortunate medical events that followed her like a shadow. They discovered that her first husband, Michael Wallace, had died at 38 of a heart attack that was never autopsied. They learned that David's will had been changed just before his death, leaving everything to Stacey and nothing to his own son. The suicide of David Castor was looking less like a tragedy and more like a tactical execution. By the end of that first week, the investigators had a working theory. David hadn't locked himself in that room to die. He had been trapped there. They suspected Stacey had spent that quiet Monday using the turkey baster to feed David the antifreeze while he was in a semi-conscious state, perhaps drugged by the medicine she so frequently prepared for him. She had watched him die for 48 hours, waiting until the poison had done its work before calling the police to discover the body. Stacey Castor had played the role of the grieving suburban wife to perfection twice, but this time she had left behind a physical signature. The turkey baster, the neon green liquid, and the missing fingerprints were the first threads in a tapestry of evidence that was about to unravel her entire existence. She was no longer just a woman who had lost 2 husbands. She was the prime suspect in a double homicide, and the detectives in Syracuse were about to do something Stacey never anticipated. They were going to start looking at the graves she thought were safely closed. The Black Widow had caught her prey, but she hadn't realized that the web was now closing around her. The death of David Castor was initially treated as a tragic, if somewhat suspicious, suicide. But the Onondaga County Sheriff's Department couldn't shake the clinical, almost detached demeanor of the woman standing in the center of the crime scene. Stacey Castor didn't look like a woman who had just lost the love of her life. She looked like a woman who had just finished a difficult shift at the office. As detectives delved into her background, they discovered a pattern that was too symmetrical to be accidental. This wasn't the first time Stacey had stood over a dying husband, and it wasn't the first time the cause of death was a sudden medical mystery. The first red flag was the turkey baster found on the nightstand, its tip stained with the neon green hue of antifreeze. Suicide by ethylene glycol is an agonizing, protracted way to die. It causes the body to crystallize from the inside out, yet David's body showed no signs of the violent struggle typically associated with such a death. Then there was the physical evidence. David's fingerprints were absent from the very glass that supposedly held his final drink, while Stacey's were found clearly on the vessel. The locked door also didn't sit right. Investigators suspected it had been manipulated to create the illusion of a barricaded room. Driven by these inconsistencies, investigators turned their gaze backward to the year 2000 and the death of Michael Wallace. At the time, Michael's passing at the age of 38 had been attributed to a heart attack, and no autopsy had been performed. Stacey had successfully convinced everyone that Michael was a sickly man whose heart simply gave out. But with David Castor dead of antifreeze poisoning, the detectives needed to know what was really in Michael's system when he took his last breath. They sought, and were granted, an order to exhume Michael Wallace's body. The exhumation was a grim, high-stakes gamble for the prosecution. If Michael had truly died of a heart attack, their case against Stacey would likely crumble. But as the medical examiner performed the delayed autopsy, the truth finally emerged from the earth. Michael Wallace had not died of a heart ailment. His kidneys were riddled with the telltale crystals of ethylene glycol poisoning. He had been murdered in the exact same manner as David Castor, 5 years apart. Stacey wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a serial poisoner who had perfected her craft in the quiet suburbs of Syracuse. The investigation then shifted to the how. How had she managed to administer the poison without her victims noticing the bitter taste? Antifreeze is notoriously sweet, a fact Stacey likely used to her advantage by mixing it into high-sugar drinks or medicines she prepared for her husbands. She was the gatekeeper of their health, the one who brought them their evening cocktails and their morning juice. She had watched them both fade away over several days, likely using the turkey baster to top off their dosage while they were too weak or drugged to resist. The financial pattern was equally damning. In both cases, Stacey was the sole beneficiary of significant life insurance policies. She had cashed in Michael's policy to clear her debts and then moved on to David, whose estate, including the successful jewelry gallery, was worth millions. Detectives found that David's will had been expertly forged shortly before his death, diverting his assets away from his biological son and directly into Stacey's hands. Every move she made was calculated to ensure her financial upward mobility, regardless of the body count. Despite the mounting evidence, Stacey remained defiant. She played the victim in the press, accusing the police of harassment and claiming they were targeting her because they couldn't find the real killer. She leaned on her daughters, Ashley and Bree, using them as a human shield against the public's growing suspicion. She portrayed herself as a woman plagued by bad luck, a narrative that worked on some members of the community who couldn't believe a local mother could be so cold-blooded. But the detectives were closing in. They had the forensic proof from the exhumation, the fingerprint evidence from the bedroom, and the forged documents from the estate. The Black Widow was cornered, but Stacey Castor had one final, desperate move left in her repertoire. She was about to commit a betrayal so profound it would shock even the most jaded investigators. A move that would target her own flesh and blood in a last-ditch effort to save herself from the needle. The investigation was no longer just about the husbands. It was about protecting the children who were still living under the roof of a monster. As the exhumation of Michael Wallace stripped away the last of Stacey's defensive layers, the detectives in Syracuse prepared to make their move. The forensic trail was no longer a theory. It was a confirmed map of serial murder. But Stacey Castor was not a woman who accepted defeat. Recognizing that her own arrest was imminent, she pivoted toward a strategy so sociopathic it would forever mar the lives of her children. She decided that if someone had to go down for the deaths of Michael and David, it wouldn't be her. It would be her oldest daughter, Ashley. In September 2007, Stacey invited then 20-year-old Ashley into the backyard for a drink. She offered her daughter a special cocktail, a mixture of vodka and Sprite, claiming they needed to relax from the mounting pressure of the police investigation. Ashley, trusting her mother implicitly, drank the concoction. What she didn't know was that her mother had spiked the glass with a lethal dose of crushed prescription pills. As the drugs began to take hold, Stacey led a stumbling, semi-conscious Ashley to her bedroom and tucked her in. The next morning, Bree, Stacey's younger daughter, found her sister unresponsive in bed. Beside Ashley lay a multi-page, typewritten suicide note. The note was a chillingly convenient document for Stacey. In it, Ashley supposedly confessed to the murders of her father, Michael Wallace, and her stepfather, David Castor. The note claimed that Ashley had been overwhelmed by guilt and could no longer live with the secrets. It was a perfect, packaged solution to every legal problem Stacey faced. When the authorities arrived at the house, they found Stacey in a state of hysterics. Yet, even in her grief, she was quick to point the officers toward the note. While Ashley was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, detectives began to pore over the document. It didn't take long for the confession to unravel. First, Ashley's friends and family insisted she didn't know how to use a typewriter or word processor with that level of complexity. And more importantly, the tone of the note didn't sound like a 20-year-old woman. It sounded like Stacey. The most damning piece of evidence, however, was a single repeated misspelling. Throughout the typed note, the word antifreeze was spelled as anti-cree. Detectives remembered that during her earlier interrogations, Stacey had made that exact same verbal slip, pronouncing the poison with a distinct ch sound. Furthermore, a search of the family's computer revealed a deleted draft of the note, created at a time when Ashley was confirmed to be at school. Stacey had sat at her computer, cold-bloodedly typing out a death sentence for her own daughter, while the girl was in the other room. Miraculously, Ashley Wallace survived the poisoning. When she woke up in the hospital, she was horrified to learn of the note and the accusations. She told investigators that the last thing she remembered was her mother handing her a drink that tasted bitter. The betrayal was complete. Stacey had not only attempted to murder her child to cover her tracks, but she had attempted to destroy Ashley's reputation and soul in the process. The Black Widow had finally overplayed her hand. By trying to frame Ashley, she had provided the final, undeniable proof of her own guilt. The community of Clay, which had once offered Stacey sympathy, now looked at her with pure revulsion. She had moved from husband killer to child predator. With Ashley's testimony and the forensic evidence of the forged note, the Onondaga County District Attorney had everything they needed. The woman who thought she could manage any situation was about to find herself in a courtroom where no amount of nursing or special drinks could save her from the truth. The trial of Stacey Castor in 2009 was a high-stakes confrontation between a mother's cold ambition and the survival of her own child. The courtroom in Syracuse was packed as Ashley Wallace, having miraculously survived her mother's special cocktail, took the stand to testify against the woman who had tried to frame her for serial murder. Prosecutors meticulously dismantled Stacey's web, presenting the forensic evidence of the exhumed Michael Wallace and the neon green anti-cree slip that exposed the forgery of the suicide note. Stacey's defense, a frantic claim that Ashley was a troubled girl who had acted alone, crumbled under the weight of computer timestamps and the testimony of medical experts who detailed the agonizing nature of ethylene glycol poisoning. In February 2009, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Stacey Castor was sentenced to 51 years to life in prison, a term that ensured the Black Widow would never again step foot in the quiet suburbs of Clay. She remained stoic as the handcuffs clicked, offering no apology to the daughters whose lives she had shattered for the sake of $1 million payout. Stacey's story came to a final, abrupt end in June 2016, when she died of a heart attack in her cell at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, an ironic, natural end for a woman who had spent decades manufacturing natural deaths for others. Today, she is remembered not as a grieving widow, but as a predator who viewed her own family as collateral in a pursuit of a life she never truly earned. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below.